Good day to everyone dialed in. In today's webinar, we will cover a realistic guide to transition in practice. Today's interactive panel discussion will include practical solutions you can implement as you work through your firm's global transition plan away from using Libel. This webinar is intended for those familiar with the challenges Libel reform poses to cash markets and derivative markets, and our panel will help provide current context, advanced feedback, and some practical implementation answers. A short overview of Libel transition. In 2017, the FCA announced that they will no longer guarantee the production of Libel beyond 2021 year end. In November this year, IBA, the administrator of Libel, and the FCA both made announcements highlighting the suggested path forward around Libel cessation dates, which we will be going into detail later in today's discussion. The industry now has a clearer path forward for Libel with milestone dates. In this webinar, we cover what this means and how to help further the adoption of alternative risk-free reference rates and the use of fallback rates. We all eagerly await feedback from the consultation period early next year. We want you to leave this webinar after 60 minutes with practical suggestions to consider based on the recent IBEL updates, understanding of key milestones to work towards, far more knowledge about the depth and quality of IBEL-related data sets already available to embed into your risk and scenario analysis, and lastly, to ensure you are future-proofing your IBEL transition plans. Your questions, and we'll interactively monitor the Q&A chat forum throughout the webinar. We will have 15 minutes dedicated at the end of the webinar to answering your questions as well. I'm delighted today to be joined by our speakers. Let me first introduce our guest speaker, Mr. Valerio Romano, Head of Treasury at Intesa Sanpaolo, based in London. Jacob Rank-Broadley, Head of Libel Transition for Refinitiv, based in London in our Benchmarks and Indices business. Alexandre Hadouin, Head of Rates at Refinitiv, based in Geneva. And I'm Candice Dott, looking after global sales rates across enterprise data and trading. Based in sunny Johannesburg in South Africa, and I will today's panel moderator. Starting with the first question for you, Valerio, please can you help the audience better understand and interpret the recent November IBA and FCA announcements and what they mean?
Thank you, Candice. Thank you for your invitation and welcome everybody. So I would switch to the most recent developments. These are related to the announcements made by the IBA, so ICE Benchmark Administration, who is the administrator of Liable, announcing the incoming consultation for cessation by the end of 2021 of sterling, euro, Swiss franc, and yen Libor. This was very quickly followed by a second announcement regarding the possible cessation of the dollar Libor for the 1 week and 2 month tenor by the end of 2021, and for the other tenors by mid or the end of June 2023. The consultation is ongoing, and it will be closing in January. The regulators have jumped in, and they mentioned the key bottom line here is that by the end of December 2021, we should not rely on Libel to continue to be published in 2023 for the US dollar. Libel means more an indication of giving more time for the market to reduce the positions, but not to use Libel for new business. So this leads us to a second aspect, which is more practical regarding what what to do or what we should expect. So probably by early 2021, so say March perhaps, between March and June, the FCA may give an announcement and for cessation of those libels. So we end up, as it is shown in the second half of the slide, into, particularly for dollar, 3 periods we should be looking at. So from this announcement from the FCA until the end of 2021, you can continue to use the Libor because it's representative, it's published, no problem. Between the end of 2021 until mid of 2023, essentially the 1 week and 2 months would be interpolated. They would no longer exist, but they would be interpolated out of the other tenors still produced by a representative panel. And the third period would be after 2023, then you switch. You drop Libor and move to the alternative rates.
Thank you, Valerio. That's really helpful. Given we now know when Libor is likely to end, what alternative benchmarks are available in the market, Jacob? Thanks,
Candice. There's a whole series of alternatives, and a huge amount of work has been done on this. So as a background, many of you may be familiar with the working groups that have been established. There are 5 working groups, one for each jurisdiction. So we have the ARC in the US, we have the working group based here in the UK, and then Euro, Swiss franc, and Japanese yen have similar working groups on their side. For each one of those, they've essentially recommended an overnight risk-free rate that's the alternative to Libor. Some of those are well established. So in the UK market, SONIA was a well-established benchmark even before the FCA announced the end of Libor. By contrast, in the US market, software was brand new. They had to start from scratch and they had to build a benchmark that would be fit for purpose and suitable. And I think that's reflected in terms of the level of maturity of those different benchmarks and the adoption in the market. What those benchmarks capture is an overnight risk-free rate. And so that's operationally somewhat different from what Libor is today. So the first thing is then how do you make it useful and operational? And in most circumstances, institutions need to then compound those overnight risk-free rates to get something which would have some representation of a term structure or some element of tenor to it. And they can either use a forward or a backward-looking compounding approach, but that's the preferred solution for many markets. But it's not the case in every market. Now, what we've seen over the course of this year is then the development of term rates. And so here we've got forward-looking term structures. So these are fundamentally different from the overnight rate. These are much, much closer to Libor because they have this element of saying, what's the cost of borrowing for 1 month into the future, or what's the cost of borrowing for 3 months into the future? And this is a particular interest area of focus for myself, and also an area of the market which is maybe reliant on that term structure. So things like trade finance, some segments of the loan market really are massively dependent on these forward-looking term structures. In respect to that, Refinitiv are very excited. We launched our prototype version of Term SONIA back in July. We'll be moving to a production rate very shortly. We're actively engaging in the US dollar market, responding to the ARC's RFP for a term SOFR rate. And we continue to work with the ECB and the Euro Working Group around the provision of a term ESTA. So I won't talk too much about that, otherwise I'll be here for a whole hour. But the only other thing I do want to touch on is synthetic Libor. And this is kind of the last major challenge you've got. So once you've taken your derivatives and your securities, you've put those to a compounded version of the overnight rates. You've taken the trade finance market, you've moved that to the term rates. You've really got the question of tough legacy. What do you do with all the stuff that's really difficult to move away? I'm not sure we've got a perfect solution here, but synthetic Libor may well play an important role. And that's really the idea that we can create a benchmark that's not Libor in terms of banks contributing rates, but it's actually taking a term structure, adding on a credit spread, calling it Libor, and then hoping that helps ease some of the pain around the transition.
Thanks, Jacob. Extremely helpful. I'm going to quickly ask Alex to provide us an update around the ISDA fallback rates and their applicability, please.
Yes, thanks a lot, Candice. Happy to be speaking in that webinar. So as explained by Valerio and Jacob already, when Libor will stop being published, ISDA fallbacks are a possibility to be used to replace Libor if you adhere to the ISDA protocol. So even if they are not applicable today because you still have Libor fixings, ISDA fallbacks are available in Refinitiv solutions. So by solution, I mean the desktop, so that's the screenshot you see on the slide, but not only the desktop, you can also find this data in enterprise products such as Datascope, for instance, if you want to consume this data elsewhere in your own systems. By the way, worth mentioning that Refinitiv is officially an authorized redistributor of the ISDA fallback. So if you go on the ISDA website, you'll see Refinitiv logo. So currently they are free of charge in our solutions, but you'll have to subscribe to a license as soon as Libor will be updating. And I think to come back to what Jacob was saying, to summarize a good way, I think, to understand what fallbacks are is to consider them as a credit spread adjustment on top of a compounding risk-free rate or term rates, and the combination of that compounding or term rates plus the ISDA fallback creates a kind of synthetic Libor that can replace current Libors.
Thank you, Alex. And Valeria, are you able to take us through, just from the context of Intesa Sanpaolo, how you are applying this to new and outstanding contracts?
Thank you. I tried to summarize this in a, it's obviously a simplified version, but I think it can be helpful to a great extent. So you will see we divide synthetically or very quickly the word into cash and derivatives, and so there would be top and bottom part, and then we divide between outstanding, or let's say legacy, and the new products. So let's mention, for example, derivatives, which have been discussed also in the first part of the webinar. So say, for example, you want to go for a new derivatives, the best solution for you would be to stay away from Libor and just go straight to RFR where available. So say, for example, Sonia would be a no-brainer. You just go for, sorry, Sterling would be a no-brainer. You just go for Sonia, just forget about the Libor Sterling if you can. There will be a moment when you will not be allowed to do that. FCA already asked at the beginning of this year to the market makers to base their quotations on Sonia as the first choice. But if you really need to use Libor, then include the ISDA supplement that would help you to have like a fallback clause, which is a kind of a safety net in case Libor disappears. And for existing contracts, you can still rely on ISDA protocol, which helps the transition for existing contracts indexed to Libor.
Thank you so much. In terms of what we've discussed so far with regard to risk-free rates, being very different, obviously, to Libor, how is the industry dealing with these differences, Jacob? If you can start with covering what the key differences are, please.
So there's two key differences from an operational perspective. The first of those, which I guess we've touched on both, but the first we touched on most was this difference between an overnight looking rate versus a forward term structure. So Libor has a forward term structure. The most popular tenors of Libor tend to be the 1 month, the 3 month, or the 6 month rate. And what that tells you is, in essence, the expected cost for a large bank for borrowing for a period of 1, 3, or 6 months. That's quite different from what is the cost of borrowing at a risk-free rate overnight. So you need to find a way of creating that term structure. Big fans of creating term SONIA, term SOFR, term ESTA type rates where it's appropriate. But that only solves part of the operational problem. The other key challenge that you need to deal with is this element of credit spread. And Alex touched on this with the ISDA fallback rates. Now, what you're measuring with a risk-free rate is, you imagine that you have a bank which is guaranteed. There's no possibility they could go bust. There's no credit risk in there. And that's not the same as the panel banks that contribute to Libel. And you need to find a way of capturing this. Now, the ISDA fallback way takes a very sensible approach and says, hey, if we take a look over the previous 5 years, what was the difference? What was the average credit risk measured within Libel? And that's not a bad starting point, but that doesn't capture the fact that this is a really dynamic number that we're looking at. So if you were to plot Libel versus a risk-free rate, and you were to start at the beginning of the year, everything looked relatively stable. We then saw, as we went into February and March, things started to blow up. And as that volatility came into the market, all of a sudden the credit risk element just became massively bigger. And then as we get past that period of volatility and the markets calm down again over the summer, we've seen that go down. So this idea of taking a snapshot of the average over the past 5 years doesn't capture that dynamic element. So the other way that someone might want to think about this is a dynamic credit spread. So you could then start to use things like CDS to build up that measure of credit risk, and you get a bit more sophisticated. But I think those ideas or those kind of elements are very much at an early stage. But all of this that we're talking about so far is trying to replicate and recreate Libel. And I think the real question is actually, well, you know what, Libel's worked really well for the industry. It's not perfect. And this is an opportunity for us to take a fresh look at things. And ultimately, as an institution lending to a firm, what you want to make sure is that there's a risk-free market rate available and there's an element of the credit spread. And so just taking that into account, thinking about new ways, and I think there's some really good points in that.
Thanks, Jacob. And Alex, perhaps you can just add to what Jacob's just mentioned in terms of the changes we've been applying to our analytics.
Yeah, exactly, because as a vendor, as Jacob has just said, we embodied new content, like the fallback I've shown before. We're creating new data as the term rates, but we also need to enhance our analytics library to support the specificities of the new risk-free rates. The one that Jacob mentions, like backward-looking, is different from forward-looking, compounding rates, fixing lags. So we have enhanced our analytics library to price also floating rate notes on new risk-free rates. We do see many more issuances now on FRNs, on SOFR, for instance, especially for longer maturities. For shorter, corporates are still issuing on Libor, but for longer, they do issue quite a lot of new floating rate notes on SOFR. And what we've done is that we have followed the recommendations of the various working groups, especially Bank of England on SONIA, who gave really detailed information about the fixing lags and everything. So, just to cut it short, we as a vendor are working on exact same topic as our customers to deliver relevant solutions to the market community.
Thanks so much. Valeria, I'm going to pass back to you. We're all well aware that there are many challenges in the industry with regard to the identification of liable contracts and the management of their related exposure. Could you share a little bit more about how Intesa Sanpaolo is identifying contracts and securities impacted by the liable transition?
Sure, thank you. I tried to summarize what the key points could be in a Libel transition project. So here are those key areas you would expect to be developed under such analysis, and probably also areas where a regulator may ask you how you are getting ready. So just focusing on the second point, which is particularly delicate, on Libor exposures, you can see this issue of the identification into two areas. One is the exposure, so how much am I exposed, my company is exposed to the Libor and the cessation associated with it. So very much like a risk management type of approach. And the other one is more linked to the contracts and clauses you are using. So more for legal and business units and negotiating those contracts. What type of fallback am I using? Are they effective in case of discontinuation? So this takes to the idea of having a flexible IT platform that can help you extract this information on a regular basis, because regulators also expect the senior manager to be updated regularly. So it's not like a one-off exercise, more like a continued and can also be tricky. So say, for example, you have a revolving credit facility, which is multi-currency. So you can have a portion that is undrawn, and a portion that is drawn, maybe it's drawn in euros, so it doesn't show up like a Libor, but in its belly you have the Libor exposure. So you need to be careful with these features. There's also been some development in the application of artificial intelligence for the scanning of all the contracts to spot where the Libor is mentioned and what type of clauses are used.
Thanks, Valerio. That's really interesting. I think importantly also, Jacob, if you could quickly share with regard to how, other ways are that we're actually helping the industry with their exposure management.
Valerio touched on a lot of points which are really good around some of those bespoke customized contracts. It's really important to get a handle on that. As Refinitiv, we supply a lot of the data to the firms in the industry, and we can't deal with those customized and bespoke contracts, but we can help with is those elements of standardization. And so there's obviously a whole host of securities and derivatives which have Libor embedded into them. And within our databases, our reference data today, we already identify where those securities reference Libor. So it's a really easy way to start and just to think through, where have I got exposure, where do I need to get a handle on where there could be a problem in my institution. What we're doing to build on top of that is then say, how do I really understand what's going to happen to this exposure? What's the fallback language that's appropriate? And here there's a huge amount of work just going through the prospectuses. I don't think, if you go back 10, 20, even longer, further back, people hadn't considered what was going to happen in terms of the Libor cessation. And that language hasn't necessarily been put in a nice taxonomy and nice structure. And so what we're doing is we're going through all those prospectuses, we're putting it into our taxonomy, we're making sure it's usable, and we're just providing a bit of structure so people can actually take that data out, because we're not talking about odd security here and there, we're talking about tens and tens of thousands of securities that need to be addressed. Once you've got that fallback language incorporated, and importantly, it's only the fallback language that's actually from a legal perspective. There's a lot of recommendations out there. We've seen some great stuff come from the ARC, but it's guidance rather than contractual. Then it's key to take into account things like trigger events, transition, and all of that needs to be incorporated and put into a good data model. Once you've got a handle on that, to Valerio's point, it makes it much quicker then just to turn the handle on your IT systems and publish another report the regulator can look at, see how you're getting along.
Brilliant. That led me perfectly into the next question, which is back to Valerio to help take us through what Intesa Sanpaolo have practically been doing from an IT development and system requirements perspective, and really what's needed to be taken into consideration. Thanks, Valerio.
No, thank you. It's a difficult question. It has a lot of areas to be addressed, but let's say most probably you want to review and redefine your methodology for pricing of products, just what Alex and Jacob mentioned to, your hedge accounting strategy and framework, and the risk metrics you are using to manage the financial risks. So from this review, you should have a set of requirements for the IT implementation, and this is very much like a cross-sectional effort, starting from front office to the accounting systems, going through product control, middle office, back office, and with the need to be ready for the deployment of and the management of these products, or the new ones, or those which are old and transition. So say, for example, when the cessation of Libor is triggered, then you have, for example, for the dollar 2023, boom, you have the switch. So imagine if you have a large portfolio of derivatives, you need to manage those, and it is not a small task if you don't have adequate IT systems. There's some way to go, obviously, especially on the loan market, or cash, if you like, but we're getting there. The modules for RFR are deployed, and so it should be becoming less and less exotic as a concept from an IT perspective.
Thanks, Valerio. I know, Alex, you speak to a considerable number of clients across banks and corporate treasurers who are all undergoing similar transitions with their systems. Can you shed a little bit more light?
Yeah, sure. As you said, we have discussions every day with our customers working in banks, but we should not forget corporate treasurers, auditors, also risk consultancy firms providing working with those corporates. They are all heavily exposed to Libor directly because they have loans or swaps or bonds, or indirectly if they are just giving advices. So there is a very, very strong appetite currently for new risk-free rate data to update the front office, middle office IT systems, as Valerio has just said. So the market data available today to feed those applications with new data is wide. You know, we have obviously fixings, but it's not only having the real time, it's also having a long historical database. So even for new risk-free rates, you know, we are backfilling some of the time series. We've got steer futures. So even if the liquidity is still a lot on euro dollar now, you've got, for instance, CME 3-month SOFR futures, overnight index swap, where Sonia is established, but USD SOFR is new and coexists with OIS Fed funds. In euro, you've got Esther OIS that coexists with Ionia. So basically there are duplications for some markets, and also fallbacks that we talk about, and very importantly, derived zero curves that are key for rates derivatives valuations, on which we will come back later today. So, and as I mentioned earlier, it's also about having the right analytics tools to be upgraded to manage properly the new convention and feed the IT solutions. So I just want to mention that we also provide our analytics APIs and tools as libraries, APIs that can be used outside the desktop in a very transparent and easy way.
Thanks, Alex and Valerio. I know the other topic that's close to both of your hearts is communication. Given the materiality of the Liable transition and the different characteristics that we've discussed around risk-free rates versus Liable, how do you manage client communication around this topic, Valerio?
That's a very sensitive question and aspect. I would start from the guideline from the regulator. So the FCA especially has been very vocal regarding the protection of the customers, or fair treatment of those customers, which ties in what Jacob was mentioning regarding the credit spread and how we transition from a rate which is which embeds a credit and liquidity spread to another benchmark which doesn't. So fair treatment, I would say, for both sides, so for customers, but as well as also the lenders, I would argue. In communication, it becomes absolutely crucial, the timeliness. So if you are too late, then FCA automatically would think that, or may assume that you have not addressed the customer needs, and therefore you are opening a conduct risk, and they would ask questions why you didn't do that. So, but on the other side, there's a fine line between communication and advisory. So also banks would be, or in general, institutions would be careful in crafting the communication just to make sure that the advisory element in it is properly managed. So, but you do have tools or mitigants for this conduct risk and, if you want, possibly litigation risk. So you can use, for example, fallbacks, the use of an ISDA protocol is very powerful. You should be careful with the less powerful fallbacks, like those you may have in loans, where, for example, it's the agent who has the prerogative to choose the fallback rate. Probably that's a trickier type of fallback vis-a-vis the client. And most importantly, you can start repapering the loans, for example, or for the bonds, it's a painful process because you need to, get the agreement for the whole bondholder. So, but you do have tools for that.
Thanks. I know, Jacob, you've been having a considerable number of client communication sessions and internal sessions. Can you give us a little bit more detail around the type of communication we're having to undergo?
So we're, very fortunate that we don't have to have a lot of those more challenging conversations that Valeria mentioned. Being a data vendor, it's our relationship which takes place typically with a financial institution around how we can support them with that process. And that's quite a different conversation to the one actually with the client. And the clients notably can be very sensitive to this. They may not necessarily be actively following it. There's a lot of work to do to get them comfortable with how that's going to change. But as you go through and educate someone, I think one thing that's come out from the conversations we're having, which is a really key area of focus, is how do you get over that hurdle of talking to someone who may not necessarily be following this particularly closely, picks up on the headline that they currently have a rate of Libel plus X bips, and all of a sudden is being offered a new deal, which is a risk-free rate plus more than X bips. And at that point, literally on face value, it looks like you're getting a worse deal. The markup is higher, it looks like it's more expensive, and that's not necessarily the case. It can be economically equivalent just because we don't have this credit element that we've been talking about in the risk-free rate. I think it's going to be key to manage that successfully, given that Libel transition is such a complicated topic, and it's very difficult for everyone to follow what's going on. How do you get people comfortable with the new rate where those numbers seem higher? So I don't envy any institutions who are going to have those conversations, but I think it's going to be a key one to play out, and I hope it goes smoothly.
Thanks. I want to quickly change track now. We're going to go to a polling question. So any of you on the call that are able to please select some of the answers that I'm putting up on screen, just to clarify what the question is and some of the selections that we have. What is the most material challenge you're facing today as part of your firm's Libel transition? Is it identifying which contracts reference Libel? Is it determining which fallback language applies? sourcing new risk-free rates, or the customer adoption of new risk-free based products, or other. If you can select one of your answers from the screen poll question in front of you and submit them, we'll share the results shortly. But just while you're actually selecting the answers that are most applicable to you, or the answer, I'm just going to quickly hand over to Valerio to hear from his perspective what the most material challenges within his organization.
There's a enticing question. I would say just a comment: if you are still working on the contract mapping, then it's time to accelerate on that because the regulator expects also to actively manage those contracts and switch. So point number one should already be ongoing and can be challenging, of course. I have a soft spot for the second one. If I think in terms of, in a broader sense, the concept of repapering. Therefore, the improvement of your documentation to manage the transition is it's a delicate process. It's painstaking. Now easier for the derivatives thanks to ISDA, not quite so for cash products. So the second one is fascinating, I think.
Thanks, Valeria. And Jacob, do you want to quickly provide your input before we go to the results?
Yeah, I'd go for number 4. I've been actively following the transition of activity to new risk-free rates. I think that on the US dollar side, the CCP change in mid-October, big boost. Some of it seems dying away, so I think it's still got a long way to go. I think that's going to be a tough one. I think derivative markets, they've only started their transition. At least in some cases, they've got a long way to go. Cash markets, I think it's going to be a pretty heavy lift for people to get comfortable with new rates and start to adopt. Having said that, I don't think the other ones are straightforward, but I think that one's going to be the toughest.
Thanks. So just quickly looking at the results there, I guess quite evenly spread, but clearly customer adoption of the risk-free rate-based products is coming out tops. Thank you for participating in the panel, and hopefully that's kept you awake. Let's move on to the next question. In terms of just the considerable amounts of IBOR transition-related data sets available and already available to support valuations, modeling, and risk analysis, many of these data sets are actually free of charge to use currently, and also importantly need to be permissioned in order for you to be able to feed them into your IT systems and applications. Alex, can you share a bit more detail around the alternative data sets available that we can help our listeners better understand, and what data is actually available that they might want to use?
Yes, sure. And it was very interesting to see the answers saying that market adoption is the main concern. I quite agree with this. The amount of market data and new risk-free rate is huge, and it's almost growing every day as market adoption increases. So basically, as our answer as a vendor and the coverage is fully driven by market adoption / liquidity. Let me give you some quite interesting figures on liquidity to understand where we are in terms of market adoption, as it was a key topic in the poll, and also because market data available in our solution is directly linked to liquidity. So let's focus a little bit on the derivative space. So derivative is typically interest rate swaps, OIS, caps floors, swaptions. It's very clear that most of the liquidity remains on Libor instruments, especially for short-term maturities, shorter than 2 years, but notional are growing on new risk-free rates month after month. For instance, if we take the ISDA October figures, there is about 13% of the rates derivatives now traded on new risk-free rates. Well, you can say it's a bit low. Yes, it is quite low, but the percentage is growing months after months, and the notionals on Libor are huge. And what's interesting is that we see for trades with higher maturities, higher than 2 years, which means maturity after the Libor end of life, the percentage of new risk-free rates trades is actually 60%, so it's big, so the adoption is there. And the picture is also different depending on the rate you look at. SONIA is well established, SOFR is growing, and as Jacob said, especially since October when LCH CME, the CCPs decided to switch to SOFR discounting for cleared swap, whereas ISDA is behind. So yeah, to go back to your initial question, Candice, as you can see in the screenshot, the data sets we have covers risk-free rates fixings. So SONIA, ISDA, SOFR, etc. And not only we have the latest fixing, it's also important to have time series and quite long time series. So we have worked on backfilling some of those historical data. We have the term reference rates, as Jacob talked about on SONIA. We have compounded rates and indices when available, the ISDA fallback, and a big amount of inter-dealer broker data in the derivative space, like OIS, forward OIS, basis swaps like SOFR against Libor. And by the way, people that were exposed to that spread have been affected by the announcement that Libor was delayed, and also risk-free rate, floating rate nodes, and loans data with our LPC data. We have also specialized broker feed from Phoenix and Tradition, exclusive data on Icon that is extremely accurate for all the most liquid derivatives, especially OIS. So it's a lot of data, but easily accessible in our product.
And continuing with that theme around data, and obviously a lot of what we've discussed around risk-free rates already and the differences between Liable, how can sales traders, corporate treasurers price derivatives with these new risk-free rates, Alex?
Yeah, so as explained before, the new risk-free rate derivatives, and let me switch the slides, are becoming more and more liquid. And one of the alternatives to fallback, and that's also what is driving the liquidity, is to unwind your existing Libor interest rate swap, typically, and enter into a new risk-free rate OIS instead. And to do so, you need to be able to price those new OIS, which is not that easy. Usually in the rates derivative space, the key element in the valuation is the zero coupon curves that you use to project your future cash flows, but also to discount. By the way, you can discount Libor rates with SOFR curves because we have the SOFR curves. If I try to give you some details about the OIS curves we have, we could spend 2 hours on this, but just quickly, there are bootstraps from liquid OIS, especially coming from TradeWeb, which is a very good source of data, very tight bid-ask. It's trades done on their platform. And then we use a cubic spline interpolation method and a bootstrapping method to deliver smooth curves for most of the new risk-free rates. And what is also important, and I know we have auditors there in the audience, is to be transparent on the constituents we use for those curves so that the valuation is totally transparent. So it's exactly what we are doing. And using those curves, you can reprice any derivatives, OIS, basis swap, cross-currency basis swaps.
Thanks so much, Alex. Just really last question for the panel. Valerio, in terms of helping conclude the questions, can you please share a quick summary of any additional or ongoing IBOR developments which are on your radar that you'd like to share with the audience? Be some good homework for them.
Yes. No, thank you. I think it's a lot has been done. There's some parts where you should be keen on looking, and so I mentioned a few here. So we talked already about the build-up in liquidity, especially the US dollar market. Alex, I think your comments were spot on. There's also development to be seen for the term rates. So these are what Jacob referred to. It's in beta version for sterling and soon to go on production. That's interesting, very useful for trade finance, for example, where you need a forward-looking rate. Soon we should have some similar developments for the dollar, for SOFR term rates. And the other aspects to look into is the new powers that the regulators would be given for, particularly the FCA. They will have powers to, among other things, force the administrator to publish what they call a synthetic Libel. So they would be very much calculated like we explained for the ISDA, and therefore a forward-looking term rate plus a spread. And these would be quite helpful for the management of tough legacy Jacob referred to. So I guess these are the themes to look at in the next few months. And of course, consultations. It is worth keeping an eye on that as well and reading them and participate.
Thanks, Valeria. I think we're going to move on to questions now for the panel, just mindful of time. There's some really great questions coming in, so thank you very much. Keep sending questions in and we'll make sure you get answers. But in terms of the first question, I want to actually pass on to you, Valerio. Products linked to new risk-free rates come with new features, such as lockout periods, etc. Are banking systems able to cope with these features?
It's a good question. For this, I would say there are some teething problems for sure, but don't get disheartened by it. New modules are deployed by vendors. The main ones, definitely Refinitiv. You should be looking at development also for your proprietary systems. It's not rocket science. I mean, there's a lot of work behind it, but you can produce these engines. It's true, it's complicated in a way that you have to look at many different aspects. You mentioned the look-back period. I could add the management of floor. Every day you need to check if the floor has to apply or not. Really painful. But this can be automated. And there will be modules to be deployed. So I would say eventually we will get there. But please rest assured that we do have cases of even important deals where the agent bank or lenders and the borrower rely on Excel still. So it will come.
Good old trusty Excel. Thanks, Valerio. Another question for you, Jacob. The Loan Market Association, and specifically, let me just quickly get to the question, sorry. The Loan Market Association are recommending compounded in arrears with 5-day look back without observation shift. Can you share a bit more details with regard to the LMA feedback? Given you have mentioned the possibility of forward-looking term rates, do you think this will change to try and keep it as much in line as the current process?
So I'm not going to answer the question here, but for term rates, it's actually a different part of the loan market. So the term rates, I think, play a really important role in retail loans, SME loans. By the time we get to the kind of loans we're talking about with the LMA corporate loans, these won't be using term rates like Term SONIA. They'll be looking using compounded in arrears. So I'm going to pass on that question. I don't want to give the wrong advice. Alex, I don't know if this area makes you feel more comfortable.
Yeah, maybe Alex wants to add.
Yeah, let me add something on the first part of the question. It's not a direct answer. I apologize in advance. We will also provide a spreadsheet that allows to calculate realized compounded rates with the fixing lags where you can change from 1 day to 5 days. That will follow the regulator, the working group's recommendation, especially Bank of England. So it will be very easy to use for that part. And then, as Jacob explained, term rates is a possibility for loans as well going forward.
Thanks, Valerio. I know you might have something to add.
But I would say it's an interesting question. I think you may like making a distinction between the sterling space and the dollar space. So for sterling, perhaps the orientation for the use of term rates is for trade finance. So for, let's say, syndicated loans, it's unlikely they would recommend the use of term rates. But in the dollar space, term SOFR is one of the rates mentioned in the waterfall of rates you can use in a loan. So you could have a situation where, which is actually fascinating, you could have a decoupling of different jurisdictions, but it remains to be seen. But in sterling, for the time being, would be rather on the trade finance.
Thanks. And a question very close to my heart, which I'm going to ask Alex to provide some feedback and a summary on this. Again, I know you've covered it, but it seems to be coming up a lot, relating to the ISDA fallback rates, and very specifically the availability of these fallback rates via our Refinitiv platform solutions, both on the desktop and via feeds. Can you please share how and the fact that we are an authorized redistributor?
Yeah, so I pushed to the audience the slides we used during the webinar. So yes, the fallbacks are there. So in Icon, we have an IBOR page. Simply type IBOR to find that IBOR app. And there is a dedicated fallback rates tab that you see currently on the screen. And each of the points with the flags here, you see there's a quote. So if you look at the quote below, USD1M FSRF equal ISDA. So this is the quote for the 1 month USD Libor. So you got the value here. And this is a RIC, which means that you have real-time fields, and you have also a time series. If you look at the chart on the right, next to the quotes, this is the time series of that USD 1 month Libor fallback. It's coming from ISDA. We are officially an authorized redistributor of that data. For now, it's free of charge. When Libor will stop being updated, there will be a cost associated to get access to that data. And as it's a RIC, it's also available outside Icon, meaning in Datascope. You can feed your applications, your Excel spreadsheets with the data, because there is one individual code for each of the line you see on that screenshot. So answer is yes, and it's available now, today, even if the fallback are not used currently, just for you to test.
Thanks. And if you're looking for more details with regard to how to get permissions, please reach out to your account manager or ask us to get back to you following this webinar, because we'll take you through the step-by-step process to get the free of charge data accessible for you. One last question for Valerio. A lot of smaller firms will not want to commit to an alternative rate and risk being an outlier ahead of knowing what key global firms plan to do. Is there a market consensus around systematically important banks and their Libor approach?
That's interesting. No, thank you, Candice. I would say consensus has been collected through a long process, especially driven by the working groups, which have been introduced at the beginning of the webinar. So eventually you end up with a solidification of those best practices, and these are available easily in the web pages of those working groups. So say, for example, the Sterling RFR working group. You can easily find the best practice and the market standards for loans, for bonds. The derivatives is already covered by ISDA. So you do have already a pretty solid framework. You can move around and find your way. So I think the heavy lifting has been done brilliantly by the working groups and regulators as well. So I guess it's time to look at these standards and implement them. Not easy, but
Thanks, Valerio, and really great to have you contribute as the final question came in. I'm very aware that there have been lots of questions, so tremendous participation from the audience, and thank you to my colleagues in the background who have tirelessly during this webinar been answering those questions. I'm going to close out the webinar today and really thank our knowledgeable speakers, and a special thank you to you, Valerio, for your time and valuable contribution today. Seeing the challenges through your eyes and through the Intesa Sanpaolo organization really help, and hopefully have helped a number of the audience members take away the practical steps and answers to share across their own organizations and be better prepared for the further developments that unfold ahead of us in 2021. Thank you so much to everyone for joining this webinar. And really, on behalf of Refinitiv, we greatly appreciate and value your time. I know that there is a lot of demand for time on webinars nowadays, so hopefully you walk away with some useful and practical steps and questions that we can continue to answer for you. We will be sharing the recording of this webinar and slides presented today, and then any questions that have not been answered will be addressed following the webinar directly with the person that asked the question. I just want to draw it to your attention that there will be a short pop-up survey at the end of the webinar. Please do take the extra 60 seconds or so to fill that in. It's a little bit of a report card for all of us as panel speakers. It's great to get feedback and really objective guidance and advice as to what's been helpful and perhaps what hasn't been helpful in order for us to improve and really get your feedback on making future webinars more productive. If you've got any recommendations or suggestions that you'd like to be covered in future sessions and webinars, please tell us what those are. And finally, thank you again. Really tremendous audience participation. And I'd like to bid you all a really fond farewell to today's webinar, and thank you for joining. Goodbye, everyone.